Good evening, I'm John Batchelor. This is the John Batchelor Show. The organizing of the United Nations, the New York City streets are blocked off, and the police and the various security services are keen to get traffic east side, west side. However, the town comes to a halt each year, this time of year, mid-September, good weather, in order to celebrate the community of nations gathering together. The President of the United States addressing the General Assembly in these last hours, talking about the crises in the world and the challenges. He talks about Ebola. He certainly talks about the bombing and the war fighting in Syria and Iraq, and there'll be more on that later this evening. And then there's the struggles we know very well in Afghanistan and in Africa, especially Somalia and Kenya. However, one challenge that, to my knowledge, was not raised by the president today. We're going to Hong Kong. Gordon Chang of Forbes.com is here with me. This has to do with democracy, which strikes everyone when they first hear about it as a strange crisis. A democracy is not a crisis anywhere, but it is in Hong Kong because there were promises made many years ago when Hong Kong was handed over by the British colonialists to the Chinese Beijing colonialists. And those promises, it is believed, have been betrayed. So within these last days, Hong Kong college students are cutting classes to protest the betrayal of the promises of democracy. Mike Davis, a professor of law in Hong Kong, joins us to comment on this. Mike, a very good morning to you. I do not believe the Hong Kong Occupy Central was mentioned today in the United Nations from the podium. However, it's very much on the mind of the people in Hong Kong. These students leaving classes, is this an excuse, Mike, or are they seen as a force to challenge Beijing? Good morning to you.
Yeah, I think of course, they want to draw attention to the decision that Beijing recently made that essentially is going to have a kind of vetted election where it would choose the candidates, I guess sort of like the Guardian Council does in Iran. They wanted the nominating committee here in Hong Kong to be pretty much pro-Beijing, and then the promised universal suffrage would then be one where everybody can vote, but only for candidates that Beijing approves of. And so the students and Occupy Central movement and all these things are sort of the civil society response. And I think the students in particular represent an interesting development because Hong Kong's democracy movement now has become much younger than it was, a couple years back when a lot of the old guard democracy activists were dominant. But now we have a generation of under 20s, really, who are really out there and leading the debate. And so I think this does pose something that Beijing will probably be concerned about.
You know, Mike, this week you have a boycott of university students, and you talk about the movement getting younger. Well, it's going to get younger on Friday when the high school students start to take to the boycott as well. I get a question, though, which has just really puzzled me. You know, you go back to the beginning of this month, you have the leaders of Occupy Central, which is this civil disobedience group, basically said that the democracy movement was close to death. And now, at the end of this month, you're seeing all of these demonstrations and protests. You know, the students walked from Admiralty to Central yesterday, which is really, really interesting when you start to think about how these students have just not really cared about what the police say. So what happened between the beginning of this month and now to revive the democracy movement?
Well, I think what really was being said then was that Beijing had taken such a conservative position, not even being willing to reach accommodation with even moderate Hong Kong Democrats, that they left the democracy movement basically with no avenue to deal with Beijing, and they're going to have to take their cause to the street. Once you do that, then you're asking even a greater sacrifice, not just marching on the streets in accordance with some permit process, but actually engaging in civil disobedience and so on. And ordinary people often don't want to do that. So once Beijing has taken such a confrontational position, then I think the challenge of mobilizing the demonstrators is much greater. The youth, though in these last few months has shown a greater willingness to make those sacrifices. And so we're all watching this unfold. The Occupy Central civil disobedience campaign has not started yet. That was a sort of mini version yesterday where the students went beyond what was permitted in their march. And, you know, when this has happened, they don't arrest them on the spot typically, but sometimes take note of who was there, and then we hear a month later that someone's being prosecuted for something they did last month. So we don't know how heavy-handed the government will be over these developments.
You know, Benny Tai, who is perhaps the most prominent co-founder of Occupy Central, has talked about October 1st, National Day in China, as being the day that there's going to be civil disobedience in Central. So what's going to happen on October 1st when that important day rolls around?
Well, so far, he calls it a banquet in Central. So while on that day, usually in the convention center, the government officials and Beijing officials will all be celebrating and toasting National Day. And what Benny proposes is that they've asked actually for permission to use Cheater Garden and areas in central Hong Kong. So merely if they got permission, then it wouldn't be civil disobedience. So what we don't know is whether they will then linger on in these places, or whether the government will even allow them to go to these places. So it seems to be that he's signaling some kind of launch on that day, but they have to be very careful, because if they make that too explicit and don't ask permission, they could be arrested under some kind of conspiracy charges in advance. So they've been very coy about what actually they're going to do.
Mike, we've watched this assemble itself for quite some time. Are there any surprises so far? You're very well informed. Something that you've seen that you didn't think was coming?
Well, I can say I absolutely didn't think it was coming, but I think the Beijing decision was so far against democracy and made a mockery of democracy in a sense. And I would have thought Beijing could have accommodated a more moderate position because, in a sense, Beijing worries about too much attention to resistance and protest in Hong Kong. But Beijing is the chief proponent of those protests. By taking such a hardline position, it seems that they are turning Hong Kong into a base of resistance, the very thing they don't want to do. But some has to suspect Communist Party officials just don't get it. I don't know. They seem to be clamping down on moderates. They did that even yesterday in convicting a moderate Uyghur academic and sentencing him to life up on the mainland. So I think moderates, are in danger now. It seems that because their voice is so much more convincing, Beijing views them as more of a threat than even more extreme voices.
Would that be competition in the party, Gordon, for someone to be more militant, more hawkish, more intransigent than someone else?
Yeah, I think what's going on, John, is that the party's in distress. And so whenever you have that situation, the safest thing to do is to take the hardest line possible, which I think this is another symptom of real failure of the party. And so all these people who say, the party is safe and secure, Xi Jinping has consolidated control, I think that's all garbage, because we're starting to see a real attack which don't make sense at all in Hong Kong against this Uyghur scholar, just across the board.
Mike, sometimes here, when there's going to be protests, confrontation with police, we've seen it, students or very well-prepared young people show up with helmets or gas masks or in some fashion prepare for violence. Have you seen any evidence of that so far in Hong Kong, especially among these students?
Well, not in the demonstrators. There's Hong Kong democracy movements over the many, many years, and I've had some involvement in the past as an Article 23 concern group member, have always been peaceful. And it's sort of the code for demonstrators in Hong Kong that they have to be peaceful. But what's happened over the years is the government has become a little more and more aggressive. So in the old days, you almost could imagine these policemen handing out flowers, not literally, but at least they were friendly faces along the side of a march. Now there's these shields in front of them, and it's wall-to-wall policemen. policemen often outnumbering the marchers. So I think this creates a kind of confrontational situation. And I think that's what's going to be the measure of how this Occupy Central ultimately goes down, is just how heavy-handed the government will be. If common sense prevails, then I think there should be no violence. But it's hard to know, because I know the demonstrators are paying very careful attention to this, that they're not going to resist, that they're going to be peaceful.
Mike Davis is a professor of law at Hong Kong University. October 1st, right, Gordon?
October 1st.
Just coincidentally, it's next Wednesday when we're together.
Right. And you know, the Communist Party no longer has common sense, John, so this should be interesting.
Now, it'll be October 1st in China, 12 hours before it is here, so we'll be coming to this story the morning after whatever the conflict is, and looking to a peaceful demonstration and peaceful conduct by the authorities in Hong Kong.
And it will be peaceful, except that maybe the police won't be peaceful.
Mike Davis, Gordon Chang, I'm John Batchelor.